Fans of the Horus Heresy, thank you very much for joining me for a model, build and tactics review of the Kharon Pattern Acquisitor for the Sisters of Silence in the Horus Heresy. And this model is by Forge World. So this is a recent release for the Horus Heresy range by Forge World, and I have to admit it is one of the most intriguing vehicles I've ever seen made by any science fiction game. So this is a really fascinating model and it's been a lot of fun to build, and I think we're going to have a bit of fun with this review. What we're going to do in this review is we're going to take a look around the model. I'll call out some of the details and interesting features. I'll then talk about the build experience, so what was it like and how well did the model go together. Then I'll move on to doing some size comparisons against other figures from the Horus Heresy range. And I'll be doing a lot of comparisons against transports because this is a transport option for the Sisters of Silence. And then finally, I'll finish up by talking about rules and tactics for this vehicle. So let's start off by having a look around this model. At the moment, it's mounted on its flight stand. And if we turn it around, we're going to take in some of its details and features. And it is a very interesting vehicle. There's all sorts of images and influences that have gone into this. A very immediate influence for me is this sort of conning tower arrangement. It makes it look like a primitive submarine. So something from, say, the late 19th century when submarines were in their early stages of development. So yeah, absolutely fascinating looking model. Let's take it off the stand and look at it a bit closer up. So this is a full resin kit. We're going to start off by looking at it with this closed nose on it, and then I'll swap it over to look at the open nose afterwards. So gild yourself against your preconceptions and get ready for an exploration of an unusual model. First up, we've got this wonderful eagle design. It's a relief design with the eye in the center, and it's a single-headed eagle, and we've got these sort of what look like retracting sheaths. This is an opening front, and then we've got these weapon clusters here and here. And the detail on those is very nice. Each one's got 6 barrels. So it looks like some sort of rapid fire or perhaps even rotary affair. As we look down the side, we've got these tubes, which are actually the missile launchers that this vehicle has. And we have these doors on the side, which look very much like what you might expect from a medieval torture device, the Iron Maiden. And of course, this vehicle, as well as being a transport for the Sisters of Silence, is for capturing psychers for transport via the black ships back to Earth. So yes, these have got a very sinister appearance and indeed meaning. We've got these sort of smooth panels like this with all this flush riveting. So this is sort of like 1950s, 1960s aircraft or rocket design. That's a theme that runs throughout the whole vehicle. Normally in 30k and 40k, it's the opposite. You have lots of raised rivets on Imperial vehicle. This is the opposite way around. It's to kind of fit with its stealthy nature. Got these nice venting on the side here. We've got this long tail with these air intakes either side of the command position, or what I called the conning tower, and there's lots of nice detail around that as well, as we can see. Around to the other side again. And we've got this long tail. If we then turn the model over, start at the front, we've got a large air scoop or air intake mounted underneath the nose, and if we look at it like this, it makes me think of certain sharks, to put it mildly. Yes, very much so. Perhaps that predatory appearance is quite apt given the purpose and nature of this vehicle. And we've got some underside detailing as well. This is an anti-gravity vehicle, and these design cues here are common to other Legio Custodes Imperial Grav vehicles from 30k, such as the Pallas, Caladius and Coronus. Then go to look at the rear. We've got this sort of ribbing on the underside of this tail array. We've got this large extended triangular section, which is called the exhaust. Within the exhaust there's a fan, and then it's got this grill over it. This is all tacked together at the moment for painting purposes. We've got some great details in the rear there. And then we've got these engines as well, which I think have been designed to look a bit more stealthy than normal Imperial power plants. They're not exactly mega stealthy by modern standards, but you know, it's keeping with the theme of the game and the universe. And if we take a look down the other side of the tank, we see the reverse of the first side we looked at. And it's a symmetrical vehicle. The only asymmetry is in the conning tower with this piece here. Apart from that, it's completely symmetrical. Now, a great thing about this kit is you get a selection of 2 noses. As well as this solid closed nose, which I've magnetized as you can see it. And I did a series of videos about building this vehicle and doing the magnetization, or part of it. And I'll leave links to all those in the description. So if we take that off, we then have an alternate nose, which is this piece. And we can just drop that on like so. And the look of the vehicle is changed quite considerably to show it in the mode where the access port into the troop bay has been opened, and we've got this sort of iris design. And then we can see the Helion cannon arrays, as they're called, I believe. We've got this great looking design with the retracted panels of the nose, which have withdrawn back to open the front end up. Now it looks like something a bit different, doesn't it? And to be frank, it looks quite a lot like a sandworm of Arrakis from the film Dune, the books Dune, because long before the film came, there was artwork of those sandworms in the style of the films. And if it's not directly based on it, it's a pleasant accident, I think. So let's talk about influences and design cues on this model more, because it's absolutely fascinating. The reason I'm talking about influences is because I think a lot's gone into this vehicle. This vehicle was designed by Stuart Williamson, who's a Forge World designer who's done a lot of the tanks. He designed the marine tanks, I believe, like the Kharon, the super heavy tanks like the Fellblade, the Glaive and the Falchion. He did all the Mechanicum vehicles as well, so really diverse and experienced designer. So yes, we've got the Iron Maidens, which are medieval inquisitorial torture device influences. What else have we got in here? Well, for me, it looks a lot like a primitive submarine, as I said, from sort of like the late 19th century. And this epitomizes that look, but also things like this part as well. We've got 1950s, 60s aircraft and rocket design with the paneling, the flush riveted paneling. It also has something of a 1930s look to it as well, in terms of the style of it. And I guess very particularly could say it looks like some science fiction of the period. Several people have commented to me that this looks like it's something out of the original Flash Gordon series, and indeed the 80s film as well. So there's another possible influence that's gone into the design of this model, Flash Gordon. So we've got submarines, Flash Gordon, Iron Maidens, Shai-Hulud. Let's see what else we can find hiding in this thing. Bit of natural history perhaps? The shark look, maybe? I'll come back to natural history. So those are kind of like little individual influences, but for me there's something that I spotted in terms of the overall plan and appearance of this vehicle, which I don't know if this is an accident, but I certainly spotted it. And it seems like it's too coincidental. One of the things that I studied many years ago was paleontology at university, and I've got a general interest in paleontology, and in particular vertebrate paleontology. Now, when I was looking at this tank from this perspective, it put me in mind of some ancient groups of fish, a very primitive fish, or certainly very ancient fish, perhaps not primitive in the true sense of the term. And let me show you why. And for this, we've got a little bit of iPad picture help. So let's just spin that around like that. Here we go, here we have a picture. Now, for those of you who don't know what this is a jawless fish, and it is called Drapenapsis, and it was from the early Devonian period, 350 million years ago, let's say approximately. It's a very, very ancient fish. It's part of a group of jawless fishes called a Pterapsidid. And I saw that, and I saw this, and I thought, hello, bit of a similarity there. And you can see what makes me think it, because these fish had these enormous bony head shields and then these long tails without true fins in the modern sense of what we see with fish. And we look at this fish from another angle, you can see the sides have got these sort of open flutes. And so if we turn it around, there you go. And if we put the two side by side, hopefully you can see what I'm thinking there with the plan view look of this vehicle. And for me, that looks more than a little bit coincidental in terms of look. So I wager that there might have been a little bit of a paleontological influence on the design of this vehicle. It's a Drapenapsis for 30k. I think it's safe to say that the Kharon is a real melange of design influences, and perhaps more so than any other Heresy era vehicle I've ever looked at. So now let's move on and talk about the build. I did a series of videos talking about the construction of this vehicle, which I will leave links to in the description. If you're interested in the build, I would highly recommend you checking those out. To summarize it briefly, I mean, it's not a particularly complex kit. There's maybe about a dozen parts, and it's quite a simple hull design. You've got this large main hull which sits on the bottom, you've got an upper hull here, and then you've got the rear hull there, and then you've got the two noses that go on the front like that. Now, as always with Forge World vehicles, I found the real trick was getting all the hulls to fit together, and my trick was to work from a point of view of having the front of this section aligned with the lower hull and this nose, and then I just worked it back, and it took a bit of time to do. There's a few parts that needed heat bending, this needed bending into shape, and this needed some quite tricky bending into shape. So it took quite a while to do, and I did it over probably the course of a week or so, on and off, just doing a bit at a time as I had the opportunity to work on it. One thing I would say, if you buy this, don't rush assembling it. If you want to get a good fit and finish, just gradually work through it, tease out the gaps and any parts that don't fit properly, and mine in the end actually fit together really well. I had to do a bit of work to recut the lines of the detail here and here to get it lined up properly, and then I needed to do some filling work there and there to get it all lined up, and then a bit of filling work around here and here. That was where I went slightly off with the pin, so I put a pin about so long running through here to strengthen this attaching to the hull. I went a little bit offline there, so I just had to fill in where my drill burst through, so that's not a feature of the model. I did a bit more filling along the edges of the upper hull. That wasn't a lot, but just sealed it off a bit. And then I put a bit of filler around these nose pieces, as you can see, and that's just to get a smooth finish against the hull. I had a bit which didn't line up quite right, and you can see that's this air intake here. And I had to do a bit of work on this. I had to cut down the sides a bit to get it to fit laterally, but then it was also short depth-wise because I had to build this out a bit. You can see probably about a millimetre of material I had to put on there, maybe a bit less than a millimetre, and that's just to get it all to line up. I mounted the air intake forward and just filled the back of it. In terms of the magnets, this kit is really cool, so it comes pre-drilled, so you get 2x8mm pre-drilled points on the lower hull, and here and here, here and here. So I put 2x8mm N52 neodymium magnets into those. You've also then got a guide locator hole on the top of the hull, and that just snaps in. I mounted an additional 4x3mm N35 neodymium magnet in the top here, because before that was on, this nose was prone to falling off with not too hefty handling, so that just holds it secure as well. I also had to cut down these two locating pegs, this one and this one, because they didn't locate properly on these two and they wouldn't fit. But that's fine, to be honest, they still work okay. And if I remember rightly, I had to cut material off the top of those to get them to fit in here. So these are a bit taller than these parts together line up to be. So that was another little adjustment I had to make. In terms of constructing the rear details, that's all very straightforward. That's just sticking those on. This grille you could leave off to paint. The engines and this exhaust I've not yet stuck on to make it easy to paint. In terms of assembling the open nose, you've got these three cowl sections to go on and the two guns. Two guns are dead easy, they just stick on. I just stuck them into place. I didn't bother pinning those in the end. And once you put these on, I filed it off and did some filling around it to get everything to line up properly as well. Bit of work there, but given the complexity of the detail involved, not too unreasonable. And everything did actually line up really well on this part. Everything was correctly sized, so that was really good. And then the final thing to think about on the build is the actual base. Now this is quite a heavy model because it's all solid. I mean, I don't know, I've not weighed it, but I guess it weighs, I don't know, 600 or 700 grams maybe. And it's got to mount on this resin post. Now, I didn't think it was a very strong attachment just there. So you get this large oval base. What I did was I drilled the resin post through and put a piece of 1mm thick piano wire through. I put the resin, I don't know, mounting plate on. On the underside, I mounted, this is 1mm thick plastic card, and I stuck two sections on the underside, avoiding the grids. I sanded it so it's flat, so the base fits flush with the ground. Using a chisel, I cut a groove into this, and I then bent the piece of wire through 90 degrees to give a really strong attachment. And then finally, I then stuck this in place, and then finally I stuck the peg on. And the whole assembly now is really strong. And as you can see, I left almost an inch, maybe a slight bit more than an inch of wire protruding, and drilled the corresponding hole into the vehicle to mount it. And the reason I did that is it's a heavy vehicle and it needs some decent support. So that's an idea for mounting it. I mean, I'll see how I go with that. If it doesn't work out well strength-wise in the longer term, what I'll probably do is just get a large piece of acrylic rod. So probably about 4mm as the thickness of this aperture is in the bottom. Drill it in, redo this base, and then I think that'll give a strong attachment point. But we'll see. It'd be nice to use the actual provided materials without having to spend more money on basing it. And the other reason to do that is around the balance point of this model. Because of a substantial weight differential between this nose and this nose, there isn't a common balance point on the model. And I messed around with this for quite a while and there isn't. And I don't really think there's any way to weight it, because when it's like this, it's tail heavy. When it's got this on, it's nose heavy. I think using the post approach is the best solution. It's a simple kit. I found that in the end, with some care and attention, it actually went together really, really well. Yeah, so cool model. And yeah, I guess a bit like the look of it, it was a novel and unusual construction as well. I'm going to bob the closed nose on again, just because I quite like it. One final thing to talk about on the model front is the quality, and this is something that I do hark on and on about in my reviews, but it is important to talk about the kit quality on these resin models, because if they're not well cast, they can be a nightmare to put together. This one, as I say, it fundamentally went together. There were some inconsistencies and outsized parts, but in this particular case, I managed to hide them and work them out. Overall, very good really, and I'm delighted with the end result. And I did enjoy the experience. I really enjoyed building this kit. It was a lot of fun. Okay, so let's move to this size comparison. So let's start with some infantry comparison. So let's go with a normal human first. Here we've got the Solar Auxilia Renegade Surgeon Avis Joven. Really nice model. It's a good size vehicle. It's not a small vehicle. For the second comparison, I've also got his Auto Gurney. And this is about a Terminator size model, and we can bob that there. Moving on to the third stage of the size comparison, we have a Navigator, which is the event exclusive miniature from a few years back. Yep, not looking much bigger. Got to have a Space Marine, Adeptus Astartes of the Iron Hands Legion in Mark II armor. As we're talking Talons of the Emperor, we should really have a representative under them, and here we've got Ixion Hale, the Tribune. And then finally, Lord Buckethead to also stand alongside, and so let's put those two taller miniatures around to frame it. And I guess the fact that it's on this mounted flight stand adds to the height of the vehicle and makes it stand out more. Right, let's clear these guys away and move up the size comparisons. Right, we'll do one comparison against a Dreadnought size vehicle. We've got a Contemptor Dreadnought armed with a Kerry's Assault Cannon and a Dreadnought Close Combat Weapon with a Graviton gun. And standing that alongside the Kharon clearly tells us it's a pretty big vehicle because it towers over the Contemptor, and it would also probably be a bit taller than a Leviathan. I think the Legio Custodes Telemon Heavy Dreadnought is taller. Right, so we talked about transport, so let's move on to a series of comparisons against transport vehicles. First up, we've got the classic metal box, the Mark 1C Demos Rhino from my Iron Hands Legion. So all the time we're going to have to bear in mind that this thing is on a hover base. So width-wise, it actually compares pretty directly to the Rhino. However, when we're talking about lengthways, we can see the Kharon is substantially longer, and even accounting for the hover base, it's probably about a third taller. And if I line those up nose to nose, so we'll take them out, my plow as being the nose, the Kharon is almost twice the length, including to the tip of its rear fin. So much bigger than a Rhino. Let's stick with the Astartes comparisons and bring in a Mark IIB Phobos Land Raider, again from the Heresy, part of the Iron Hands Legion. So now we've got a much bigger comparison. The Land Raider, as you'd expect, is much wider than the Kharon, and lengthwise, they're much closer as well. The bodies of the two vehicles are actually about the same length. It's only this long fin that makes the Kharon longer. Height-wise, however, then they're probably about the same height. So there's transports of the Adeptus Astartes. Now let's look at the Mechanicum. If you're talking about Mechanicum and transports, of course, the first up would have to be the Krios Armoured Conveyor. This is my modular Krios, so this is built onto the Karaknos Assault Tank chassis. Right, width-wise, how do we compare? Well, I reckon the Krios is a little bit wider. Lengthwise, nose to tail, accounting for all the bits, the Krios is just about maybe a finger longer. It's a little bit longer. Height is about the same height. However, because of the fact of this rear section, it certainly encompasses a lot more internal volume than the Kharon does. And if we do one more comparison with the Mechanicum, because I like keeping you Mechanicum fans happy, we've got the Mechanicum Macrocaride Explorator, another fantastic model by Forge World. This thing is really wide, far wider than the Kharon. It's probably got a whole track unit in width on the Kharon. Lengthwise, get them lined up properly. Lengthwise, the Kharon is longer, and accounting for the camera distortion, this section here of the tail is longer than the Macrocaride. And they're an interesting comparison there in terms of internal volume, because they've got a lot of open space in effect from nose to tail. And interestingly, they actually have similar transport capacities. Actually, the Kharon has a slightly greater transport capacity at 12 models to the Macrocaride's 10. So that's some Mechanicum comparisons. And then finally, let's bring on a vehicle from the Talons of the Emperor, the Cronus Grav Carrier of Legio Custodes, and bob that alongside. Now, this vehicle is much bigger in just about every dimension than the Kharon, much wider. Lengthwise, nose to tail, the two is almost the same length as the Cronus. The Cronus is actually just maybe a touch longer. Bring that a bit closer, we might see it better. And then height-wise, if we take the Cronus's base away, I think it's safe to say about the same height really, if you take the bottom of the Cronus to be here and the top to be here. Although in general I'd say the Cronus is a slimmer profile height-wise. There's one more. Let's pop the Cronus over at the back to join its comrades in the Legio Custodes. There's a size comparisons. You're right, I've not done any comparisons against Sisters of Silence models. That's because I've not built mine yet. I'm still waiting for the Forge World specific Sisters to be released, and they're being released tomorrow. So I'm filming this on Saturday, the 12th of August. It's a Forge World open day tomorrow on the 13th. So I'll be buying some bits then. So we'll have some Sisters soon. And when I've built those, I'll be bringing this fella back to do a size comparison. Right, and now let's move on and talk about the rules and tactics for using this in 7th edition Horus Heresy. So for the tactics review, let's swap to the alternate nose, just for giggles, because we've had the other nose on most of the review. There we go, looks nice, doesn't it? So my rules reference is Book 7 Inferno. And my rules reference is Horus Heresy Book 7 Inferno. The Sisters of Silence Kharon Pattern Acquisitor is a dedicated transport option in the Talons of the Emperor list, and it's available to a variety of Sisters units, and these are the following: Excruciatus Cadre, which is a HQ choice for the Sisters of Silence. So that's a great way of getting a bodyguard unit to go with the Sisters hero and then put them in the Kharon. That's a useful combo. The Oblivion Knight Cadre, the Vigilator Cadre, the Prosecutor Cadre, the Vigilator Cadre, the Pursuer Cadre, and finally, in the heavy support category, the Sisters of Silence Seeker Cadre. So you have a wide variety of options in terms of the sisters who can take this vehicle. Let's go through the rules on this vehicle. So it costs 125 points and has the following stats: Ballistic Skill 4, Front Armour 12, Side 11 and Rear 10. So it's a bit tougher than a Rhino, and it has 4 hull points. It's a vehicle and it has the rules of Tank, Skimmer and Fast. It can carry 12 models for transport capacity, and its access point is a single point at the front, which is this. For weapons, it has 2 twin-linked missile launchers armed with frag, crack and psych-out missiles, a Helion pattern heavy cannon array, a Spectra distort field, a searchlight and a smoke launcher. It has the following special rules of Battle Auspex, Assault Vehicle, Deep Strike and Capture Grid. And it can take a number of optional pieces of equipment: extra armour for 5 points, Armoured Ceramite for 20, and it can exchange its Helion pattern heavy cannon array for a twin-linked multi-melter at no points cost. It's a slightly more resilient but somewhat average transport vehicle. It's certainly well armed, it's quite heavily armed for a transporter. However, it's when you get into the special rules that you actually start to appreciate its real capabilities. In fact, it's a fast skimmer. It means that it's great at crossing the battlefield, whatever terrain you may be on, be it woodlands or sand dunes. It's great for doing that. It's an assault vehicle as well, which is something that the custodians actually lack as a standard thing because a Cronus in the background is not an assault vehicle, whereas this is. So that fills a tactical niche in the Talons list of having an assault vehicle. Right, let's get into the war gear because this is where it really starts to make sense as to what this does. Battle Ore Specs has the night vision special rule. In addition, it reduces cover saves of enemy targets by 1 point, so 4+ drops to a 5+, and a 5+ drops to a 6. That helps you maximize the firepower capability on this tank. Now, the Spectra Distort field is an interesting thing. This is in effect its stealth capabilities, and it automatically gets a stealth special rule, and any shooting attacks made from more than 12 inches away have a -1 ballistic skill penalty down to a minimum of a ballistic skill of 1. So this thing is going to be hard to hit. There's not many devices in the game that actually cause a ballistic skill penalty on the firer. So this is quite an unusual unit in that regard. Not sure why you'd ever be fighting orcs, but it would be absolutely, if you're fighting orcs, which are generally ballistic skill 2, you're halving their chances of hitting with that -1 modifier, so that's very handy. Next bit of gear is a capture grid. I'm not sure what this relates to, but it's kind of something at the front end gubbins, and it's a load of nets, stunners, disruptors that it uses to capture psychers or other malcontents that are opposing it. And what this means is if you make a tank shock attack, you inflict D6 Strength 5 Hammer of Wrath attacks while doing so, and that's before any death or glory attempts can be made. So that's a handy little thing to have, particularly given you can deep strike it in. And then finally the Helion Pattern Heavy Cannon Array, which is basically a series of short-barreled auto cannons. It's range 24, strength 7, AP 4, heavy 4, twin-linked and pinning. Not a bad weapon, it's like equivalent to a dual auto cannon, isn't it? It only has half the range, but then the pinning ability is an unusual one, and that fits very well with what I think this vehicle's about, which is pinning your enemy down, moving in, and then assaulting a group of sisters out of this vehicle. I think it'd be very handy at that. The capture grid is a useful device to have if you're ever in a position where you might get lynched by infantry. It gives you another option for fighting them because you can make a tank shock attack, do damage with your capture grid, and then you're still allowed to fire weapons after that. So that's quite a neat and handy ability as well. Works tactically very well with the rest of the custodian army in terms of vehicle assets, because just like the Cronus and all the other grav tanks, you can drop it in wherever you want, or you just use it as a fast moving tank in its own right. In terms of fighting vehicles, well, against medium and light tanks, this is going to be very effective. The autocannons do the job well, as do the missile launchers with the crack missiles, and the fact that they're twin linked with ballistic skill 4 gives you a good degree of accuracy. And the high speed is going to allow you to get around the side of things more easily than would otherwise be possible. You can easily make a high line for the most tactically advantageous position to let off flank shots from with those weapons. And in that role there's been a harassing tank. Its stealth capability and the Spectra Distort field's -1 to hit ballistic skill rule makes it a really hard to hit vehicle. And in the same way that the custodian vehicles have flare shields and they're hard to physically damage, well, this is just going to be hard to physically hit in the first place, and you can draw a lot of fire away as a result. And if you're playing any sort of game where you have a night fighting scenario, these things are going to be an absolute nightmare to fight, particularly in terms of return fire, because they have night vision, so they get to do all the damage to your opponent while being extremely hard to hit in return. The other key tactical role the Kharon fulfills in the Talons of the Emperor list is as the only currently available assault vehicle. Now, the Sisters of Silence have a whole range of very effective melee units available to them, and the ability to disgorge a bunch of deadly sisters close to the enemy, regardless of what they're armed with. So it doesn't matter if they're Execution Cadre, Vigilator Cadre, or Seeker Cadre, they're all armed with fairly close range weapons which are deadly up close. Combos with things like a unit attached to Genitor Kroll, the Sisters of Silence unique character. If you take the Raptorguard Cadre, which is Oblivion Knights at weapon skill 5, using this as an assault transport for those troops with Genitor Kroll in the unit makes for some very deadly close assault troops. And clearly anything you fight as a Psyker, the Sisters of Silence have got excellent anti-Psyker capabilities, and you've got the highly unusual combination of the missile launchers with the Psych Out missiles as well. It gives the Talons of the Emperor player an interesting stepping capability between the heavier and more expensive dedicated army units of custodians themselves. So it gives you an interesting midway capability vehicle that sits between the heavier grav vehicles of custodians. A fascinating vehicle, and one that works very well with any member of the Sisters of Silence infantry, I think. So very flexible as well. In that general regard, it's consistent with a lot of the other custodian troops that are good all-rounders in most aspects of fighting, and they tend to be extremely good in a certain area. So it certainly fits into the general feel and meta of the Talons of the Emperor list. Well, that brings me to the end of everything I wanted to talk about on the Sisters of Silence Kharon Pattern Acquisitor. Without a doubt, one of the most fascinating vehicles I've ever come across in any science fiction wargame, and certainly in the Horus Heresy. So what do I think? Well, I think this is an excellent vehicle. I love it for just how distinct and unusual and individual it is. I don't know if we'll ever see anything quite so unusual again. Who knows which way the Horus Heresy will go next. But yeah, it's a great model without a shadow of a doubt. So if you're like me and you want to spice up your Sisters of Silence contingent in your Talons of the Emperor list, what better way to do it? As always, I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts and observations about this vehicle. Have you got any other tactical ideas for deploying this in battle? I'll be very interested to hear, as always. But apart from that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.